I am an optimist. I always have been. I don't think you could survive in an area like this where you're very often dealing with problems or challenges, and in some cases over decades, without being optimistic that as a species and as communities and societies and companies or whatever we can change. I believe that. But I don't think change comes in straight lines. Nothing in history, except perhaps railways sometimes, comes in straight lines. What happens is the pressures build up for quite some time. Then you get discontinuous change. It's evolutionary biologists talk about punctuated equilibrium, and I think you find that in economies and civilizations as well. I think the pressures have been building up on us for quite some time, and part of it's demographic, that we're moving towards, I don't think we'll ever get there, but 9 to 10 billion people. I don't think we'll get there because I think what we're in the process of creating is a global incubator. It has all the properties of an incubator for viruses or biological agents. We have our airports, we have our airlines, we have so these things spread potentially around the world, and we saw it with SARS. I mean, SARS was stopped at about 800 dead, but it was a particular disease and it came out of a particular bit of geography, and we moved relatively quickly. I think in the next 15 to 20 years we will have a global pandemic. I think it will seriously destabilize the just-in-time economy that's been built on the Japanese model. I'm not against that model, incidentally, but I just think it's much more vulnerable than we currently imagine it to be. And we've just done a project where we, as part of our 20th anniversary, we thought, well, let's look back 20 years and see whether the agenda and sustainability and our clients have really made sufficient progress over that period of time. And then let's look 10 to 20 years into the future and try and get some sense of where all of this might be headed. And I don't think it's any accident. Well, part of that project, it's called Raising Our Game. The report is published on the 31st of May in London, but then in different parts of the world. It's actually quite critical of the sustainability movement. It's positive in the sense that the language has now gone mainstream. All sorts of companies and political leaders and so on are talking about it. But we focus on 10 divides, from the demographic divide through the digital divide and so on, many of which are, and most notoriously, the wealth divide opening out in different parts of the world. And that potentially brings a great deal of instability. If you look again back through history, it's when you have these mismatches between human population numbers and opportunity that things go seriously awry, and particularly when you have large numbers of very young male people, and you go back to the precursors of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, or whatever, and you see that pattern time and again. And I think we've got that building up in a bunch of different places around the world. So I'm an optimist, but I think we're moving into a century which will be at least as complicated. And if we're not, if we don't act sufficiently sensibly and professionally and effectively and in appropriate timescales, we'll be at least as bloody as anything we have seen to date. So is that pessimism? No, I think that's the reality we face. And I think if you put anything like 9 to 10 billion people on this planet at a time when we already have, I'm on the Council of Ambassadors of WWF in the UK, and one of the things that we look at there is not just water availability around the world, which is becoming a major issue, but the collapse of oceanic and other fisheries. I mean, it's devastating what's going on, and the way in which you're getting these feedback cycles. So people are focusing at the moment on Australia and the big dry, or the sort of drying out of Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin and so on, and you've got the climate accelerator there. But you've also got it with things like sort of coral reef bleaching, that there is this interaction between all of these different things going at the same time. So I think I totally subscribe to the Al Gore notion that we're on some sort of conveyor belt towards accelerated global destruction of key parts of our biosphere. You then add 3 billion or whatever people to that, and you've got a recipe for absolute screaming disaster. And if you've read Jared Diamond's book on Collapse, you see many of the precursors of the sorts of influences and drivers that have previously brought major civilizations down. So I'm only optimistic if we can deal with this problem at almost a civilizational level. We can't deal with it by taking phosphates out of detergents or doing recycled toilet paper or whatever, desirable though those may be. We can't even do it with sort of Bill McDonough doing a few dozen new buildings, even if those are models for other architects and so on, because we've locked in with our city infrastructures a very particular notion of the way of how lifestyles should evolve, how industry should be done, and so on. And the problem is, you look at China and the mega cities that are developing in Mexico and elsewhere, you see the same models being applied. So we're locking ourselves in again for literally a century ahead or more. But I do think something is changing. I do think we're at a stage in all of this where the science is shifting, the technology is shifting, our sense of the role of business has shifted, will shift a great deal further, and where I think we see a very different generation of people coming up, much younger, much more entrepreneurial, able to think differently from the sort of 20th century mindsets. And so in this report, Raising Our Game, we're basically saying, as sustainability, we've really got to jump our game to a different level. So next year we're going to set up our first emerging economy office in India. We're going to have to learn how to do that almost on the fly. But that's where the big issues are going to be. That's where the big opportunity is going to be. We're going to have to learn how to play in those sorts of spaces, those sorts of mutating games with new rules, new referees, and so on. And I think what's true for us is true of the wider sustainability movement. And I don't just there mean the NGOs, the academics, the socially responsible investment investors. I mean the mainstream players who are getting involved in this. People like Walmart, people like Goldman Sachs, people like General Electric. Those people, I think, are part of this accelerating wave of innovation and creative destruction. But there's still a very real question of whether it will be enough and fast enough to deal with a population of 9 to 10 billion people.